tell me how your background and your growing up years influenced the writing of this book.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, in fact, the prologue of the book, it begins with me telling a story that happened when I was 16 years old. Again, I'm imagining that these are 16-year-old readers, and I want this to be as relevant for them as it can be. And so it's the story of my first job. The summer I turned 16, I had the great fortune of the day after my sophomore year in high school ended. I mean, I went to school not too far from Joliet. I went to school in the southwest of Chicago. In those days, we had half days. I don't know if they still do. For the last day of the school year, we had a half day. And my parents were waiting for me in the parking lot of the high school. I jumped in the car where I had my backpack loaded. They took me to O'Hare Airport. I flew to Minneapolis. I took a bus into Canada, hitchhiked to Kenora, Ontario, a frontier town where I took a bush plane, a flying float plane, to a fishing camp where I had my first job that summer. I was that first summer an apprentice fishing guide. I made a deal with the camp owner that I could work for room and board as a camp laborer that first summer, with the understanding that whenever there was a break from my chores, from my duties of things like greeting all the float planes and helping load and unload the supplies and helping guests load and unload, seining for minnows, chopping wood, all the jobs, keeping the boats clean, all the jobs that are important for maintaining a camp. While I did that work that first summer, whenever I had a break, I was given the opportunity to take a boat out on the river and get to know the water. I was already a fisherman. I just needed to learn the local water. And so I did that for that first summer, and it was an extraordinary experience. What I didn't know, and how I write about it in the book, is that I knew I was starting an apprenticeship. I knew I was starting an apprenticeship to be a fishing guide. I had no idea that I was starting a second apprenticeship with Barney Lamb, the owner of this fishing camp, who was the most amazing business manager, business leader, creative entrepreneur that I had ever met, and I met him right away. And he had this wonderful leadership practice of when he asked you to do a job, a chore, especially for the first time, he educated you about it. He educated you about the importance of it. And he was so mindful. I mean, he was in the hospitality business. And so to work for a man whose job it was to create delight, not just satisfaction, but delight with his customers, with his guests, was to have, without even being aware of it, was to have my eyes open to how if you just inform the inches and the minutes of camp life, in this case, right, the inches and the minutes of daily camp life with a generous spirit, that the power of that it just becomes palpable. And so there we were that very first day that I arrived. I don't think I had been at the camp for more than 30 minutes. My duffel bag was still there at my feet. I hadn't even left the dock that I had, where I had disembarked from the plane. I'm talking to Barney, the camp owner. It's such a large camp by the time I get there that he has a foreman to help him run the camp, a man whose first name was Dutch. And apparently they had decided the previous winter to build a new dock. There was a wonderful dock that we were standing on that served most of the camp, but some new cabins had been built sort of around a point, and they had decided it was time to build a smaller dock for that cluster of cabins around the point, and that I was now going to be his work crew along with an Ojibwe Indian boy named Little Stevie, and I, both 16 years old, were Dutch's work crew for building this new dock. And so Dutch and Barney were talking about the plans, fine-tuning the plans. And as Dutch began to walk away with Little Stevie and I in his wake, over his shoulder, Dutch said something that led to him saying about the plans, and after all, Barney, we all know that the devil is in the details. A phrase that we all use frequently without thinking about it, to signify what? That yes, we know that planning itself is important, but it's the execution of the plans, right, that are really vitally important. Well, Barney stopped him. He just stopped him, and this is where my memory becomes quite precise, because there was so much certainty, so much passion, so much heartfelt expression in what Barney said that I think I must have been like a puppy dog, just cocking my head, just taking it all in. And he said, "No, Dutch. We've built this camp. I've built this camp with the understanding that God is in the details." Mm. And I didn't know, again, as a 16-year-old kid, 15 on my way to 16-year-old kid, precisely what that meant. But I spent the rest of the summer watching what that might mean. And what I discovered it meant is something that I've already stated, is that I saw Barney capacity to lead the rest of us to an attitude where we would be generous in the inches and the minutes of that camp life. Anytime we had an opportunity to be more generative, to bring something more to the guest's experience, Barney was quite prepared to do it and quite prepared to support us doing it. So there I was from the very beginning, at that moment, thinking I was there to learn how to become a fishing guide, and in fact I did guide for the next 3 summers. It was my last 2 summers of high school, my first 2 summers of college. But only in retrospect, looking back after I myself became an entrepreneur, and maybe even more after I began to teach others how to become creatively entrepreneurial, was I able to understand all of the amazing lessons that I learned that first summer. I learned, for instance, the extraordinary power of being a servant leader, because that's what I was as a fishing guide. Here I'm a 16, 17-year-old kid in the back of a boat with 30-year-old, 40-year-old, 50-year-old, very successful businessmen. This is the mid to late 60s, so it was all businessmen. And I was their servant, for sure. I was baiting their hook. I was taking fish off the hook. I was fixing them lunch. I was running errands for them. I was making sure their coffee was hot during shore lunch. I was their servant. But certainly I was their leader to the extent that I was their guide to this experience of this extraordinary place. And so again, I'm not conscious of the authority that gets invested in an effective servant leader. I couldn't have explained that to somebody else. I could feel it. I could live it. And then later, through a more mature and perspective on it, I began to fully appreciate the great power of, if you serve somebody effectively, they're eager for you to continue to serve them effectively, so they're quite prepared to grant you a lot of authority. The best kind of authority one can have is the authority that is given to you by those who would love you to be in that relationship with you. So it was a wonderful experience working for Barney up at his camp.